Welcome to Fish University, your one-stop shop for the science behind fish management. It is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network. I'm Wes Neal, your host. I'm an extension professor of fisheries and a researcher for Mississippi State University. Join me as I talk to researchers, managers, and landowners about the tools and science and the tricks of the trade for managing fish, water, and habitat. The goal is for you to have better fishing and a healthier aquatic ecosystem. So grab a notebook and the beverage of your choice and relax and enjoy Fish University.
Hello everyone, welcome back to Fish University. Today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. You'll notice that I do not have a guest. Today I am just going to be talking about pond management. We have a lot of people that contact me and they're curious about pond management scenarios and how to manage fish and how to manage plants and how to deal with all those different aspects of pond management. We try to cover those in Fish University as much as we can, but you may or may not know that my day job is as the fisheries extension specialist for the state of Mississippi. And in that role, I do lots of pond management workshops and talk to landowners, talk to county agents, and teach people how to manage their ponds better. And I have sort of a packaged presentation I like to give, which I call my Pond Management 101, which is really the basic bare bones start to pond management. And with that, you can usually take one of the topics and explore it deeper. So today, I'm going to present to you my basic pond management seminar. So please join me and we'll talk pond management, the basics of it at least. And you can always go into some of our more detailed Fish University podcasts that we give with the guests to get more information. Okay, so why do people build ponds? You may remember that back in the Dust Bowl era, there were lots of ponds being built by what at the time was the Soil Conservation Service. Now that is the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And those ponds were being built to try to raise the water table up so that the drought that was occurring during that time period would be a thing of the past. But today, ponds are built for a whole host of different reasons. Ponds are built for irrigation. You'll drive around, you'll see large 3 to 4 levied ponds that are pump storage ponds for irrigation. And of course, people will capture surface water as well to irrigate. People will build ponds for their cattle, their horses. Occasionally, ponds and smaller lakes are built for domestic water supply. And of course, if you have a small house in the woods and you're far away from everything, you may build a pond so that the fire department will have a place to pump water in case you have a house fire. And of course, people build ponds for other things like wildlife habitat, duck hunting, for example, aesthetics. Everybody knows that just waterfront property will raise the property value a lot of times. Land improvement, same kind of concept. Erosion control, and of course fish production. We build ponds for aquaculture. But what we're really going to talk about in this podcast is building ponds for the sole purpose of recreational fishing. In the U.S., there are at least 2.6 million small artificial bodies of water. That's what we would call a pond. These are things, anything from about half an acre up to about 100 acres. Some of the estimates I have seen have put that number almost double. We did a GIS study a few years ago where we tried to estimate the surface area and number of small bodies of water in the United States, and we came up with 4.5 million. They are fished by a lot of people. Over 10.5 million people fish in these ponds every year. Here in Mississippi, where I'm at, I deal with about 160,000 farm ponds. And as I said, I'm calling a pond anything that's bigger than about a half an acre. Smaller than that, it's just not big enough to manage with any real significant ability. And they go up to 100 acres. Anything bigger than that's really starting to push the boundary of what we could call a pond or a small lake and starting getting to larger reservoir size. And you can tell that in Mississippi, there's about 190,000 acres of water. So these ponds are averaging just a bit over an acre apiece. They're not particularly large on average. But what's really important about that is that these ponds, the vast majority of them at least, are privately owned and privately managed. And that means that you as a landowner, you're not going to have the state come out and manage your property for you. You have to do it yourself, which means that you need to have the information made available to you on managing ponds. And that's where my job comes in. I put together lots of resources for pond owners in the state of Mississippi and beyond that you can get for free online. If you go to the Mississippi State's Extension webpage, you'll find everything from basic pond management guides to sport fish suppliers to weed control information. And these ponds that are built, I said there's a lot of them, they are built with the intention of providing some kind of value to the land. We oftentimes think about financial value, water, lakeside property will add value to property. But we oftentimes don't think about some of the other values that ponds can provide. For example, there is an intangible value of being able to come home from work every day in the afternoon and walk down to your pond edge and feed your fish or catch a fish. You gain a personal satisfaction from that activity. And also ponds serve as a protein supply. If you are fishing your pond regularly and keeping fish from your pond, that's protein that you don't have to purchase from the store. I already mentioned there's a real financial value to land improvement. There's also an intangible value that a lot of folks don't realize. There was a study done a few years back, and in that study they found that having a hospital room that looks out over a natural landscape like a wooded area or a wood line reflecting across the surface of a lake, that the patients were getting healthier faster than hospital rooms that looked out over parking lots. Think about that for a second. Just being able to look out and see the nature of the pond and the beauty and the aesthetic value of the pond actually improved people's ability to convalesce. People get healthier faster and maybe stay healthier when they have a beautiful landscape. And the other value that can come from these ponds, of course, is a financial value in addition to land value. And that's, you can make money from ponds. We're not going to get into this today. I am going to have a guest on my show here in the near future, Dr. Daryl Jones, who specializes in natural resources enterprises. And what that simply means is people can use their land to gain income from it. And this is anything from hunting leases to fishing leases to pay by the pound fishing, even things like corn mazes. These are all forms of natural resource enterprising. Some of the things we can do with our ponds is we can have what we call pay by the pound fishing or fish out ponds. These are ponds where you bring in catchable size fish, you stock them, and your goal is for the clients to come in, catch every single one of those fish, and pay for each pound of fish that they catch. Usually there's no catch and release, it's all harvest. Then, of course, there's day lease fishing. There's a number of larger, when I say larger, maybe up to 100-acre lakes around that you can lease fishing rights for a day. Usually it's limited to one or two parties, and it's high-quality fishing. They'll provide boats, they'll provide everything, and you have a real legitimate chance at catching a fish of a lifetime. And, of course, there's long-term leasing. This is just like a hunting lease where a wealthy group of doctors might decide to go together and lease a place that's 50 miles outside of their city because they want a retreat to go to where they can go and relax and decompress and hopefully catch some good fish. The other thing that you can make money from ponds for is actually leasing them for things like waterfowl hunting and wildlife opportunities. Bird watching is becoming huge. Duck hunting carries a premium when it comes to leasing property. Again, we're not going to talk about this today. We're talking about specifically how do you manage your pond for your fishing pleasure. When I talk about pond management, I always start with what I call the 3 golden rules of pond management. Easy to remember, they're easy to understand, and they'll keep you on the right track. And they are: build it right, stock it right, and fish it right. If you build the pond right from the beginning, you'll have fewer problems. If you stock it right, and that means with the right species and the right ratios at the right time of year, you'll have fewer problems. And if you fish it right, when you fish it, you catch fish, you harvest the right fish, take them out of the pond, you'll have fewer problems. Surprisingly, and I always like to ask this question at my seminars, which of these three do you think people mess up on the most? And believe it or not, it's the third one. It's fish it right. Everybody can follow instructions on how to build a pond usually. Most people can follow instructions on how to stock a pond. But when it actually comes time to fish the pond and keep fish or kill fish, this is where people tend to struggle because, well, they paid for those fish, they stocked those fish are their babies, and they don't want to kill it because it's still small, but you have to. In fact, I oftentimes tell people that one of the worst things that ever happened to pond management was the Bass Angler Sportsmen's Society and Ray Scott back in the 1970s. I love Ray Scott and I love BASS, but Ray started the bass fishing tournaments and quickly discovered that the locals, when they'd go around to these different lakes in the United States, were getting kind of angry when these professional fishermen came in and caught their biggest fish, drug them around on stringers, brought them back to weigh in, and then released them dead. Ray went out to a trout fishing tournament out west and was absolutely amazed by the fact that these fly fishermen were catching these small little trout, gently handling them, taking their measurements, and releasing them alive right there on site. And Ray thought, well, we need to be able to release bass alive. So he came back, got with some buddies in Alabama, and they invented the first live wells. And ever since, catch and release fishing has been sort of the norm for professional fishing, for tournament fishing. And unfortunately, and I say unfortunately for pond management, not for larger public lakes, catch and release fishing really caught on. And now most bass fishermen, when they go out to these larger lakes, they're fishing for fun. They're catching bass, they're taking a picture, and they're letting them go at best, or maybe they're bringing them back for a weigh-in for a small tournament. But bass are going back in. And that's great for public reservoirs because in public reservoirs, there's a really high level of fishing pressure. There's a lot of people targeting those bass. And if we kept every bass that was caught, then there'd be no bass out there for anybody to catch. It is not a good thing for small ponds. First of all, small ponds tend to be a whole lot more productive than a larger reservoir. They can produce per acre, produce 2, 3, sometimes as much as 4 times the biomass of largemouth bass, for example, than a public reservoir. And private ponds tend to have a much lower fishing pressure than a public reservoir. So we need to take fish out, and that's where people usually mess up the most. So we'll talk about that more in just a second. So building it right, I could spend 2 or 3 podcasts talking about how to build a pond. There's a large body of literature out there on engineering for ponds. The NRCS has a really nice book. I think it's called Pond Dams, Levees, and Water Control Structures or something like that. I'd have to go back and look, but it gets really in depth into the engineering side of building levees and roads across levees, clay cores for the dam, and water control structures. But for fishing, really, there's only a couple points I want to make. And that's, first of all, ponds should not be too shallow. They should drop off to at least 3 foot deep fairly quickly. And by fairly quickly, I do not mean a vertical slope. Usually I recommend a 3-to-1 slope, which means that if you get offshore 9 feet from the bank, you should be in about 3 feet of water, or basically the water should be up to about your belly button. So a nice gradual slope that if you do fall in, you can climb out pretty easily. So it's safer for children and for adults even that might stumble into the water. But it drops off quick enough that you get to that magic depth of about 3 feet. And 3 feet is the magic depth because sunlight, soil, and water are required for plants to grow. And if sunlight is reaching the bottom of your pond where the soil is and covered in water, plants are going to grow there. So by having it 3 feet deep, most ponds are productive enough that they can shade out that sunlight before it reaches 3 feet deep. If you have a weed problem, they're usually shallow sloping ponds, and those weeds are growing out to about 2 to 2.5 feet a lot of times, the shoreline weeds at least. Like water primrose is a really good example of that. Alligator weeds are a really good example of that. They form that ring around the pond, and if the pond drops off pretty quickly, that ring is not very thick at all. But if the pond is fairly shallow, they can go out many, many feet offshore until it reaches water that's just too deep for them to grow. So you want that drop off to shade out that sunlight from reaching the bottom. Most ponds, now this is Mississippi and South specific. So if you live up north where the winters are much more severe, or if you live out in the west where it's very dry and rainfall comes intermittently, you're going to need to change these recommendations. Down here in the South, and Texas, Arkansas, Mississippi, Georgia, ponds do not need to be that deep. Most people think that the deeper the better. The reality is most ponds should have an average depth of somewhere around 5 to 6 feet. That means that the majority of the pond, on average, is going to be between 4 and 7 feet. It can have a deeper hole, but in the South, ponds don't need to be much deeper than about 10 to 12 feet. That's as deep as they really need to be, and only about 20% of the area. The deeper it is does not necessarily mean better, and more problems come with it being deeper. Now, if you do live up in Minnesota, the pond needs to be deeper because you will have the heavy ice cover in the wintertime and the potential for under ice winter kill. And if you do live out in Arizona, you're going to have a whole lot less rainfall coming into the pond and a much bigger watershed. You need to have the pond a lot deeper because your pond's going to dry up and the depth's going to decrease throughout the summer, and you want to make sure you have a refuge out there. But down here in the South, the average depth should only be about 5 to 6 feet. Now remember, I said that sunlight only penetrates about 3 foot, and you have this zone after where the plants stop growing. But that zone underneath it, maybe you have oxygen down to 4 feet or 5 feet, but rarely during the midsummer are you going to have oxygen very deep in the pond. So having most of the pond at a depth that the oxygen will reach the bottom will allow the fish to utilize the habitat. The reason why we don't want a pond too deep is that you have that low oxygen water in the deeper areas. What happens in the pond basically is you've got the plants producing up where the sunlight reaches. And so you have the phytoplankton up there that turns the water green. Your whole pond's not green. If you go down to 10 foot deep, took some of that water, it's not going to come up green like the surface because there's no sunlight for those phytoplankton down there. But that phytoplankton, when it dies, it sinks to the bottom. When leaf litter comes in from the shoreline, it sinks to the bottom. When a fish dies, it sinks to the bottom. And all those dead organic matter pieces that have fallen down to the bottom, they're going to decompose. And when they decompose, bacteria that decompose them use up oxygen. And therefore, the oxygen levels down deep drop down and can reach a point where oxygen levels are practically zero in deeper water. In fact, it can even have what I like to call a negative oxygen. It's not negative oxygen, but it's a biological oxygen demand where if oxygen comes in, it's quickly sucked out because those processes need more oxygen. So you end up with division in your lake where you have oxygen being produced up shallow. When the sun comes up, it shines down in the water. The phytoplankton, they turn the water green. The water starts producing oxygen with the sunlight. And that's usually in that upper, maybe 4 foot of water, give or take. And you get oxygen in the shallow areas. But everything that's dying is dropping down to the bottom. It's using up oxygen, and you get no oxygen down deep. And the reason for this is the lake is stratified. If you've ever went swimming in your pond or your lake, you know that in the middle of summer, you jump in the water, you swim out to the middle, and the upper surface layer feels like sweat. I mean, it's hot, warm bath water. And the lower areas where your feet are touching tend to be colder. Well, the pond is cold in the springtime. The sunlight differentially warms up the shallow layers, so they start to warm up. Warmer water doesn't weigh as much as cooler water, so they begin to separate by density. And as that separation gets greater and greater, it's harder and harder to mix those two layers. So in the middle of summer, there's no mixing from the shallow layer going down to the deeper layers, so the deeper layers never get refreshed with oxygen because the only way they're going to get oxygen is from plant production or from diffusion from the surface, and that's not happening during the summer, so you end up with no oxygen down deep. What this means for your pond is, first of all, it means your fish are probably not going to be living down deep very often. Yes, they can go down there for brief periods of time, but if you're fishing in the deepest parts of the pond in August, fishing shallow, sure, they might be up at the surface, but if you're fishing deep, chances are the fish are not going to be down there, or at least they can make runs down there for short periods of time, but don't expect them to be stacked up down in deeper areas of the pond. But what this really means is that you have this reservoir of no oxygen, almost negative oxygen water that could potentially cause major problems for you. So when this happens, if you've ever heard of something called a pond turnover, this is when that deeper area comes up and mixes with the rest of the pond. And it's usually mid-spring to the early summer when we have these strong summer storms and stratification is just setting up. So you have this area down deep where there's very little oxygen, but the storms roll in say May, and they're cloudy for 3 or 4 days of heavy rains and storms. Well, sunlight's been shaded out. You're getting less production up shallow. It means less oxygen being produced. Over time, over a couple of days, the oxygen levels in the shallow area are going to drop. And eventually you might get a really heavy slug of rain that comes in, and it creates these big streams running across the fields, and they run into your pond and they mix that pond water up because that rainwater coming in is cold. It's coming in at the surface and it just causes the whole pond to mix. Well, that brings that oxygen demand up to the surface and mixes it with the oxygenated water and sucks the last of the oxygen out. And what does that do to your fish? Your fish will, of course, die with that. When you see a pond turnover versus a normal oxygen depression, which is more common in mid to late summer, you'll know it because it's all fish all at once. Usually you'll show up first thing in the morning and your entire pond will be covered in fish. Fish will have swam up the incoming water sources sometimes trying to find oxygen. They'll be stuck in holes in the bank. They'll have shown evidence that they tried to get out of the pond, essentially looking for oxygen. And this usually kills everything down to the smallest fish, the very small fish that can get right at the interface between the air and the water and breathe what little bit of diffusion is coming in. They'll survive. So it's not uncommon to see some tiny fish survive. The issue is that depending on the time of the year that this happens, those tiny fish may be all bass, they may be all bluegill, most likely will not recover with a balanced fish population, and some kind of remediation will be required. So this is why you don't want your pond to be too deep. I've had calls from people, they'll call me up and they'll say, I have a 1 acre pond and it's 40 feet deep. Well, first of all, I don't believe that their pond is 40 feet deep. Maybe it's a borrow pit, but most of the time ponds are not as deep as people tell me they are. The second thing about that is if they're telling the truth, my goodness, what a problem that they're going to have because they got only 1 acre of area for oxygen to diffuse into the water and only 1 acre about 3 or 4 feet deep for phytoplankton to produce oxygen. And then they've got 37 feet of water that's going to be low oxygen. If they have any kind of mixing event, they're going to have dead fish. So you don't want your pond to be too deep. The deeper the water, the more of that oxygen need gets built up during the summer times, and the worse the problem is going to be if it ever does mix up. Ponds mix every single year. Here in Mississippi, we have what we call monomictic lakes, where they start mixing in the fall and they mix all winter long to the spring until stratification returns. And up north, you may have dimictic lakes where you have ice cover in the wintertime, so you get a mixing in the fall, a reverse stratification in the winter, a mixing in the spring, and then no mixing and stratification for the summer. But ponds do mix, but you want that mixing to be slow and gradual, to slowly mix down to the bottom, not a sudden instantaneous turnover event that will cause major problems. So not too deep. Let's build it right. We could talk about clay cores. We could talk about anti-seep collars, water control structures. Those are all topics for another day. Let's talk now about stocking it right. So which species should be stocked? Let's give the basic guidelines. It kind of depends on where you're located, but here in the South, the basic predator-prey system that seems to work the best is a largemouth bass or Florida bass. Those are two separate species now, as the predator, and bluegill as the prey. Notice I said bluegill, I didn't say any other sunfish. Bluegill need to be stocked with bass to provide enough prey because they are really prolific spawners. They'll spawn throughout the summer multiple times. You may get Certain areas you may get 3 to 7 spawns of bluegill throughout the summer. Bass like to eat them. They produce lots of prey for the bass. And if the bass control them and keep their numbers down by eating them, then the ones that survive will grow large enough. They taste good. People like to catch them, and they provide fishing opportunities. The largemouth bass, in turn, they control the prey populations. They keep their numbers low. And of course, they provide fishing opportunities as well. Normally, this is the basic starting point for most ponds down in the South and Midwest. I know if you go up north, you might have smallmouth bass, you might have walleye. We're not talking about that necessarily, but it's really the same concept where you have a predator and you need to balance that predator with the prey. Some other species that we recommend is you can substitute some of the bluegill for red ear sunfish. Red ear sunfish, sometimes called shellcrackers or chinkapin, and they have several other names. They do not provide as much prey for the bass, so you can't stock just bass and red ear sunfish. In fact, red ear sunfish oftentimes don't do very well in some ponds. They like to have clear water. They like to have vegetation, some vegetation, because they're snail eaters. And they're great to stock in ponds because they eat snails, and snails are an intermediate host for a number of the parasites we get in our fish. By having them in the pond and them keeping the snail populations low, you hopefully will keep the parasite populations low. And they get a little bit bigger than bluegill, so people like that as well. We also recommend channel catfish. You don't have to put channel catfish in your pond, or you don't have to put red ear in your pond for that matter, but channel catfish can be stocked in ponds with bass and bluegill. They'll take feed, they'll grow well, but if you've got a bass pond and you stock channel catfish, you must stock larger fish. So when you stock them in the beginning, you can stock little fingerling catfish and they'll grow just fine. But once you have established the bass and you fish down the catfish and want to restock catfish, then you got to stock bigger fish, usually 6 to 8 inch fish at least, should go in to kind of help prevent them from getting eaten by the bass. And the only other species we regularly recommend for new ponds is the grass carp. And the grass carp, their sole purpose is to help control weeds. They are stocked with the prey when they go in the fall. They're usually stocked at an intermediate size because many states like Mississippi require them to be sterile, which means they're triploid, which is a genetic term meaning that they've been genetically altered so that they cannot reproduce. But in order to make them triploid and then to verify them triploid, they need to be a little bit bigger so that they can pull blood from them and run them through something called a Coulter counter. You need to buy triploid fish in many states, so usually the fish are going to be 6 to 8 inches long or so when you do get your hands on them. And those are stocked in the pond at a very low density, 3 to 5 per acre, and a new pond is usually fine. Bigger ponds, I would go 3 per acre because there's so much open water, whereas smaller ponds, I'd go 5 per acre because there's a lot of shoreline area. Grass carp will eat any weeds that show up. They do have preferences for certain weeds, but usually new growth of any species, they'll tend to munch on if they're hungry. They will eventually outgrow themselves. They'll get quite large. 40, 50 pounds are not uncommon in ponds. And usually once they exceed about 20 pounds, they slow down in what they eat. So they're really effective for about 5 years. After about 5 years, they tend to get too big. They're no longer controlling the weeds. And it's a good idea to get them out and stock some younger fish. They'll also take to your fish feed very, very well and consume tons of your fish feeds. Everybody loves crappie. I love crappie. Crappie taste delicious. They're fun to fish for. They don't fight a whole heck of a lot, but they are a great fish to target. We do not recommend crappie, black or white crappie, for small ponds. They just tend to be a bad idea, and anything under about 50 acres, 25 acres, I've seen decent crappie fisheries, but a lot of times 50 acres or bigger is what I recommend for most ponds. If your sole purpose is to grow big bass, don't put them in at all, even if you've got a 100-acre lake. Crappie just simply aren't a good idea in that situation because they reproduce very erratically. Crappie can go 2 or 3 years without getting off much of a year class at all, and then get off a tremendous year class that fills the pond up really quickly with small, skinny crappie. And those crappie compete with the brim and the bass. So you'll end up with a pond full of small, skinny crappie, small, skinny bass, and small, skinny bluegill. I do hear people all the time say, well, I stocked 10 adults in my pond 5 years ago and I've never seen one. Well, good, but it can still happen. Sometimes they'll disappear for years and then all of a sudden, boom, you've got crappie. Other species to avoid: don't put any other species of sunfish in your pond. Green sunfish, for example, you don't want those in your pond. One I get a lot is the hybrid brim or the Georgia Giant, which is sold by almost every sport fish supplier. Georgia Giants are a cross between a green sunfish and a bluegill. They are great for tiny ponds. So if you've got a half-acre pond, if you don't want it to be a bass bluegill fishery, you just want to have a good brim fishery, you can stock hybrid sunfish, feed them. They'll grow really well. They'll bite really well. You got to put some bass in there too, because you don't want them reproducing. They're just like hybrid corn. Their first generation hybrid is fantastic, but once they start breeding, the offspring are not desirable. So you want bass in there to prevent reproduction. They can be grown in any pond by themselves, but never stock them with bluegill or red ear or any other sunfish because they will back cross with those parents and mess up your whole population. Any catfish other than channel catfish we don't recommend, especially bullhead catfishes. Boy, bullhead catfish will make a pond muddy in a hurry and really overpopulate. Blue catfishes, I've heard people put blue catfish in ponds. I've heard people putting flathead catfish in ponds. None of this has been empirically tested. I would stay away from all of those. Flathead catfish won't eat the little bass. They'll eat the big bass. They'll eat the biggest fish they can get in their mouth. So try to stay away from them. Of course, common carp, things like that. And gizzard shad are a species that we don't regularly recommend for most ponds because they tend to outgrow most bass predation. The exception is for trophy bass lakes. If you're managing specifically to grow big bass, that's your goal. And once your bass start exceeding 6 pounds, then gizzard shad can become a really good prey base to push them up to the double digits. But for the average pond owner, gizzard shad should not be stocked because they outgrow most of the predators in the pond. If you are far enough south, say Mississippi, Texas, Louisiana, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, you probably could stock threadfin shad. They don't get nearly as big as gizzard shad. They don't outgrow the predators. They do compete with the brim. They will die under any kind of ice cover or cold winter. So if you're any further north than the most southern states, you probably won't survive your winters. And so what about how much to stock and when to stock? Stocking order, species, and sizes are all very, very important. For an unfertilized pond, what we in Mississippi Extension recommend are 500 brim to 50 bass per acre as an initial stocking. So your bluegill can be stocked at 500 bluegill, or you can mix them up with some red ear down to, I would say I wouldn't go much lower than about 100 red ear to 400 bluegill, but you can stock those with channel catfish. 50 for an unfertilized pond, up to 100, starting to push it a little bit, and your grass carp. Everything can go in the fall. If you want to put fathead minnows in then as an extra prey base, you can. 10 pounds per surface acre would probably be a good starting point with fathead minnows. Those all go in the fall as soon as water temperatures are cool enough that your fish will survive the stocking. So 500 brim per acre, bluegill or bluegill red ear, 50 maximum of 100 catfish, and 3 to 5 grass carp per acre. The idea is for those prey species to grow during the winter, become healthy, and be ready to spawn first thing in the spring. So as soon as spring comes along, hopefully your bluegill, your red ear, and your fatted minnows, if you put them in there, are all reproducing. And then as soon as they're available, the fingerling bass should go in. And late spring, early summer, before water temperatures get too hot, these fish are going in, remember, at 1 to 2 inches. So they're not eating the fish you stocked before. They're eating their offspring. So you want those bluegills to be producing tiny little bluegills, and you want those fathead minnows to be making baby minnows, because that's what your bass are going to eat. This is a 10-to-1 ratio of prey to predators. Some of the private consultants are going a higher prey ratio. They might go 20-to-1, more bluegill to get their bass growing a little faster. That is a possibility. We haven't researched it a whole lot. If your sole objective is to grow bigger bass, the way to a trophy bass is through its stomach. So you can always up your prey levels in the beginning, understanding that you're going to have reduced growth rates of those prey. So all of this needs to go in that order at those sizes and ratios.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for listening to Fish University. Do you have a question or a topic for the podcast? If so, you can email me at Wes, that's W-E-S, .Neal, that's N-E-A-L, at Mississippi State, that's M-S-S-T-A-T-E, .edu. Or instead, please visit the Fish University Facebook page. On the Facebook page, you will find useful articles, videos, stories, and other information, as well as updates on upcoming podcasts. Not to mention, you can send me a private message with questions or suggestions. Just search Fish University and look for our colorful logo. And please follow the Fish University page. We need your support. Now back to the show.
So now you've stocked it. Now what? Well, first of all, you got to wait because those fish are small and you're not going to see them or catch them for a while. People get really worried during that first year because they have a hard time of seeing and or catching their fish. And that's not surprising. These fish are small. You won't see a lot of them, and it'll be hard to catch them. But after about 2 years, you can start harvesting your bluegill. You can fish it anytime. It doesn't hurt to catch a fish and release it as long as you're gentle with it and practice good catch and release. But don't start taking any fish out until year 2. In year 2, once you've started seeing lots of smaller bluegill being produced, you can harvest bluegill should you desire, the bigger bluegill, but be careful. Don't take out too many at this point in time. And then starting in year 3, at that point in time, your bass should have grown up. They should have spawned at least once, and then you can start harvesting and should start harvesting bass. So in year 3, you want to start your harvest for bass. And most people think that the goal is to get the bass as they grow. So I'm catching 4-pound bass, I'll take out 4-pound bass. No, your solution here to keeping the bass population healthy is to remove small fish. Those little 12, 13, 11-inch bass are eating up those baby bluegill as soon as they're produced, and you want to get them out. Take out fish that are 13 inches or less during that first harvest. Release anything that's made it over 13 inches. You might catch some fish that are 13 to 16 inches in year 3. Those fish are your fast growers. They're growing really quick. Put them back. They're going to get big. Take out those little fish, 13 inches or so, and you want to be taking out for an unfertilized pond about 15 pounds per acre per year. If the pond is fertilized, you want to double that. You can take out sunfish. It's kind of hard to over-harvest your sunfish. Usually 4 to 5 times the weight of bass you're harvesting, you can harvest in sunfish. Most people never get there. So you're talking 60 pounds of bluegill or sunfish per acre per year being harvested. That's a lot of fish. So focus on bass. Definitely get out your 15 pounds of bass per acre per year of the smaller fish every single year. And one thing to keep in mind, pond management is as much of an art as it is a science. You're going to need to pay attention. Keep records. Write down what you catch. Write down what you take out. Put a mailbox, a mailbox on a post right by the pond. And in that mailbox, put in a waterproof journal, several pencils, and a measuring board. And every time you go to the pond, write down your catch. Keep a good record of what's going on in the pond and what you've taken out, so that at the end of the year you can tally it up and see, hey, did I meet my harvest goal? Because the harvest is going to be really important to keeping that pond balanced. And I keep talking about balance, and this is kind of hard to visualize, but if you'll imagine a spectrum, and on one end of the spectrum, your bass are small and skinny, but your bluegill are big. And on the other end of the spectrum, your bass are really big, but your bluegill are all very small and skinny. That's the predator-prey spectrum. You could have lots of bass and very few prey, but the prey have all the food in the world. Or you can have few bass and lots of prey, and the few bass grow really, really big because they got all the prey in the world. Or you could be somewhere in between. And somewhere in between is where a lot of people like to manage. They manage for what we oftentimes call an all-purpose option. And this is just predators and prey of all sizes. The bass, you're going to catch lots of small bass, medium bass, and occasionally a really big bass. You're going to catch small bluegill, medium bluegill, and occasionally really big bluegill. you're not likely to be producing 15-pound bass, and you're not likely to be producing pound and a half, 2-pound bluegill. But you're going to be catching good numbers of both predator and prey of good sizes. However, if you've set your management objective as trophy brim or trophy bass, that's when you need to start tweaking your harvest to move towards one end of that spectrum. Let's say your goal is trophy bass. Well, you need to harvest more of those small bass so that you have fewer and fewer bass out there, because you want the bass to basically open their mouth and have prey swim into it. You want them to be able to eat everything and grow big. If your objective is trophy brim, then in that case, you want to keep the bass population very high, lots of small bass, and push the brim to where there's very few of them, but the ones that survive, they grow very large. I did a podcast a few episodes ago on the Slab Lab up in Huntsville, Alabama. And in that situation, they're managing for a bass crowded situation. And they're also feeding the heck out of the bluegill. And they're growing bluegill 2 pounds plus fairly regularly. If you want the trophy bass, that can require selective harvest of the bass, including selective harvest of males. And maybe I'll do an episode on that sometime down the road. So keep good records of what you're taking out and check your pond often. Fishing is a great way to tell what's going on in your pond. If you keep good records, you can see if you're meeting your management objectives. You can also pull a seine. A seine is just a net between two poles that you can buy, a minnow net basically. And you can pull that in the late spring to early summer. So basically late May to about early July. You can pull this net anywhere along the shoreline in a few spots and look at what you catch. And based on what you catch, it can tell what's going on in the pond. It's easy to pull. Just keep the net on the bottom. Go out offshore, do a swinging gait approach. Keep the lead line on the bottom, the float line at the surface. Circle the small fish, and you should be able to catch them. And what you're looking for is you want to see the reproduction of the predators and the prey. So if you pull that seine and you see lots of baby bluegill, so that when I say baby bluegill, I mean, half an inch to an inch at most. Some intermediate sized bluegill, these are fish that are 2 to 4 inches and healthy and growing fast. And some baby bass. Baby bass, depending on the time of year, they might be half an inch, they might be 2 inches. But you want to see reproduction of both predators and prey and growth of the prey, and that suggests you have a balanced population. If instead what you see with the seine is that you see very few little bluegill, all the bluegill you catch are 3 inches long, as thick as a credit card, and you don't see baby bass, well, you most likely have a bluegill crowded situation. Too many bluegill, too few predators. This may be where you want to be if your goal is trophy bass, but it also may mean that your bass reproduction is struggling and you need to stock more fish. On the other end of that spectrum is the bass crowded, and what you're going to see with the seine then is you're going to see tons of tiny little bluegill, very few, if any, intermediate sized bluegill, and no baby bass. And that may indicate a bass crowded situation because there's so many hungry bass out there. They eat those bluegill up before they can grow, and they eat up baby bass before they can grow. So you're not going to see much of anything because the bass would have been eliminated because they spawned earlier. Same thing with angling. If you see bass and bluegill of all sizes, you're balanced. If your bass are all very small and skinny, you're probably bass crowded. If your bass are few and far between and they're really big, you probably have a bluegill crowded situation. And of course, you can manage these situations to try to recover them. Bass crowded is not nearly as easy, but it can be done. It's theoretically possible to recover it. If you have kept good records and you determine you're a balanced situation and that's where you want to be, then don't do anything. Just keep doing what you've been doing. Don't change anything. If you find that you're in a bass crowded situation, the theoretical solution here is take out little bass. Harvest as many bass as you can, at least 35 pounds of those 13 to 12 inch and smaller bass per acre per year, more if you can. Reassess next year, check it again next year, and if they're still looking skinny, then continue taking out large numbers of bass until your population gets back to where you want it to be, and then you can revert back to the regular harvest rate. And if you find that you're in the bluegill crowded situation and your bass catch rates just aren't high enough for your liking, then you can always come in and stock more bass, but you need to stock bigger bass in this case. Stock 8 to 12 inch fish, put in about 30 per acre, and then bring that pond level down. If you have a control structure, a water control structure on the pond, bring the water level down to about half volume in the summer, early fall, when water temperatures are starting to cool off. And then allow that pond to stay low all winter long. And then when the spring rains come, let it refill. What that's going to do is that's going to take those new bass, pull those bluegill out of their hiding spots, and allow those new medium-sized bass to start eating down the bluegill population and try to bring it back to more of a balanced situation. And the last thing I want to talk about in the podcast today is going to be managing for water quality. We've had an episode on plant management already, and plant management is a big one for pond management. We're going to talk about water quality because I really haven't focused a whole heck of a lot on managing water quality. And I want to talk about alkalinity. People call me up and they say, I want you to measure the pH of my pond. Well, pH is important in ponds, but pH is not a good parameter to measure it from your pond water, because if your pond has water chemistry problems, pH can fluctuate a lot, even within one day. So you need to be concerned that taking a pH measurement in the morning, it might be 5. And if you take a pH measurement from the same pond in the afternoon, it might be 10. I don't recommend taking a pH measurement. I recommend checking the pond's alkalinity. The reason for this is because after the oxygen kills that we talked about earlier, the most common cause of fish death in ponds is water chemistry related to alkalinity. And this is usually something I see from about December to about April. So it's usually in the spring when water temperatures are changing rapidly and we're getting lots of rains and the fish are getting stressed out. So what low alkalinity is, it means there's few dissolved minerals in the water. Minerals coming from the surrounding geology, the rocks around there. Most of the fish will survive this low alkalinity situation, but they grow very slowly because the nutrients are being tied up in the sediment. They're not being released properly. The fish are being stressed out and they're using lots of energy into regulating their internal body conditions, and they're just not growing very well. But we can get fish kills. And what happens with the fish kills is the fish become so stressed out by all their environmental conditions that they get infected by secondary infections like bacterial infections or viral infections. And you'll start seeing a few fish die every day, all species, all sizes. Normally, you'll see the fish have like erosions on their body, ulcers, fin erosion, red spots, red fins. These are all signs that they've got bacterial infections or viral infections that have come in because their immune system was compromised. The solution to this is much like the solution that you would have in a garden that has low pH, and that is you add good old-fashioned crushed up agricultural limestone. Think about it like this. If you've ever been to a county fair and they have a game where you can win a goldfish, and you've won a goldfish and you brought that goldfish home and put it into a bowl of water, and you didn't realize it, but the gallon of water you had in the cabinet was not spring water, it was distilled water, and you put the goldfish in there, that goldfish is going to die, because believe it or not, fish cannot survive in pure water. Let me let that sink in for a second. Fish cannot live in pure water. They like clean water, yes, but not pure water. They need to have dissolved solutes in the water, things like salts and minerals. So when fish don't have a lot of salts and minerals in the water, they get stressed out and they can't osmoregulate. What happens is that there's salt in their blood and there's no salt in the water. So the water wants to enter their body and the salt wants to leave, and they have to fight that constantly. But as I said, it's an easy thing to fix. If you have your water tested and the results come back with an alkalinity of less than 20 milligrams per liter or parts per million, your pond needs to be limed. If you get a soil test and your soil test comes back, it should have a liming recommendation on it. The soil test will actually provide you an actual recommendation. The water test will just tell you whether or not you need it. Most ponds that need ag lime usually need at least 2 tons per acre. When in doubt, put more. You cannot put too much, and the more you put, the longer it's going to last. You want to lime in the fall or early winter. You don't want to do it in the spring when the growing season, because the calcium that's in the lime will bind the phosphorus, which is the primary nutrient, and cause it to not be available. Use only crushed ag lime. Do not use any other lime product. Don't let anybody recommend to you to use a different product like hydrated lime, builder's lime, slaked lime, pelletized lime, quick lime. Don't use those. Those are oftentimes different chemicals entirely. They can hurt you. They can hurt the fish. Just use old-fashioned crushed agricultural limestone rock. But it's very important. Most people think that they're liming the water. You're not liming the water. You're liming the pond bottom. Therefore, you just can't dump the lime in the upper end where the water runs in, and you just can't spread it in 1 or 2 spots around the pond. It needs to be spread evenly across the surface of the pond. This requires special equipment. If you have a small pond, half-acre, 1-acre pond, you can drive around it. Maybe the spreader truck can drive around and spread it to the whole pond. But if you're dealing with a 10-acre lake, you're going to need to get a barge out there and spread it. Or if when you build a new pond, or if you've drained the pond for any particular reason and restructuring it, get the spreader truck into the pond basin when it's dry and have them spread it then. If you can't get it out when it's dry, you're going to have to get a barge. And a barge can be anything from a specialized barge for liming to tying a couple of John boats together and throwing a piece of plywood across the front of it and strapping it down, and then dumping lime on the front, going around the pond, spraying it off with a trash pump or a leaf blower or something. Just get it out there, try to spread it as evenly as you can. The last thing I'll talk about with water quality is fertilization. It used to be that we always recommend fertilization to maximize productivity. I've gotten away from that. It is for some people, but it's not for most people. Fertilizer works because you have a fairly basic food chain in the pond where the sun provides the energy, the phytoplankton provides the production, and then that phytoplankton gets consumed by the zooplankton, any insects, small fish, and big fish. So by fertilizing, you will increase productivity down at the producer levels. You add fertilizer, you get more phytoplankton. And if you get more phytoplankton, you should get more zooplankton. If you get more zooplankton, you should get more insects, small fish, and big fish. Depending on how you're managing the pond, that can either mean more big fish or it can mean bigger fish. So using your judicious harvest, you can channelize that additional productivity into fewer bigger bass. A pond can only support its carrying capacity of fish. So if your pond can support 300 pounds of bass, it's up to you whether that's 301 pound bass or 30 10-pound bass or some combination in between. You need to manage it through harvest. So fertilizer can get you there, but fertilizer can also cause a lot of problems. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why ponds don't need fertilizer. First of all, if you're not fishing it enough already, you're just going to need to harvest more fish with fertilizer, so it's a bad idea. If the pond's already fertile, let's say it's just naturally fertile, or you have a chicken house upstream, or it drains a pasture, you're going to have an awful lot of nutrients in there you don't want anymore. If your alkalinity is low, like we just discussed, it's a waste of money to fertilize until you get that fixed. If your community is out of balance, so you've got a bass crowded situation, you're just going to make more bass until you fix that. If you're using the pond for a water source, you don't want a lot of phytoplankton and potentially cyanobacteria making the water taste bad. If you're using it for wildlife, most wildlife like clear water with vegetation, not phytoplankton. If you want it to be pretty, if you've got things like bullhead or carp or gar in there, you're just going to make more of those. So there's a whole bunch of reasons you don't want to fertilize. The one reason you would want to fertilize is for your trophy bass management. If your goal is to make giant trophy bass and that's all you care about, and you're willing to take the risks and you're willing to invest the money that costs to fertilize, then fertilization can work for you. But fertilization is not a once and done thing. A lot of folks think they fertilize in the March and then they're done for the year. And then if they don't want to do it next year, that's no big deal. Not true. Fertilization is an intensive process. It requires fertilizing about every 2 to 4 weeks throughout the entire growing season, so usually about 10 to 15 applications per year. And if you're fertilizing with the soluble fertilizer, that can get quite expensive quite fast. You got to fertilize correctly. You can't put it on the bottom. You can't broadcast granular fertilizer in the water and hope it gets where it needs to go. It's going to sink to the bottom and be tied up. You need to have platforms for that. You need to use watercolor, Secchi disc, or something to tell when to fertilize. And it's, as I said, it's about every 2 to 4 weeks. Usually we start in March. As soon as water temperatures hit 60 degrees, you hit it with fertilizer, wait 2 weeks, hit it with fertilizer, wait 2 weeks, hit it with fertilizer. And then after that, you should have a green bloom. And then as soon as you see 24 inches in the water, you fertilize again. And you do that every time the water gets 24 inches of visibility or more. And you do that all summer until water temperatures drop down below 60 degrees. So, up to 15 applications per year of relatively expensive fertilizer. And then once you've done that for a year or two and you've brought carrying capacity up, guess what? You can never stop. You've artificially raised the carrying capacity in your pond. And if you suddenly stop and it drops down, well, now you've got 2, 3, possibly 4 times more fish out there than the pond can support. And that is not going to be good news for your pond. So fertilization, think about it carefully. Don't do it unless it's a well thought out part of your management plan. So that's it. Build it right, stock it right, fish it right, and manage the water quality as needed. If you do all that, you should be able to have a nice, healthy pond. And, of course, there's other things and factors and problems that will arise, and we have information on all that available through Extension. So feel free to check that out with your own state extension office or ours. Just make sure you get your information from a reputable source. There's lots of information on the internet. A lot of it is not correct. Make sure your source of information is basing it on science, not on what Jim Bob or the co-op told me. Well, thanks everybody for listening to Fish University. If you have additional questions on pond management, feel free to email me. My email is wes.neal, Neal, at Mississippi State, that's msstate.edu. And you can shoot me an email anytime with questions. I'd be happy to help you out and answer them. And please tune in to Fish University next time. I look forward to talking to you.
Fish University is hosted by Wes Neal, an employee of Mississippi State University Extension Service and a faculty member in the Department of Wildlife, Fisheries, and Aquaculture. This podcast is part of the Natural Resources University network of podcasts. Funding was provided by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you have questions or suggestions, please go to the Extension website at extension.mississippistate.edu. Click on Natural Resources and then select the Fisheries tab in the drop-down menu. Or you can email me at wes.neal@msstate.edu.